As someone who has always been drawn more to the collecting aspect of Pokemon rather than the battling, I'm the type of guy who doesn't put a Pokemon game down until the Pokédex is complete, and I have a new diploma to show off to anyone interested. I will admit though, recent games have made my job significantly easier, with for example Legends Arceus being the first game that makes every Pokemon catchable on one cartridge. But just because every Pokemon is available, doesn't mean they're all easily scooped up like the Bidoof and Obsidian Fieldlands. Some Mon have been absolute nightmares to cross off the list, and that is exactly what we're looking at today. The hardest Pokemon to obtain in every game. Couple quick rules though. Only Pokemon that are available in the game itself count. So no event Pokemon, version exclusives from a different title, transfer Pokemon, etc. Pokemon that aren't in the regional decks are fair game though, they're in the game after all. With that said, let's get started in Generation 1 with Red, Blue and Yellow. I'm not necessarily gonna put third versions together with the original two games for later gens, but for Gen 1 I think the answer for these three games is the same. That said, there are definitely more candidates for the title here than just one, most of which are contained to one of the most exciting but also confusing locations in the game, the Safari Zone. It probably isn't news to most folks that some of the Pokemon found here are incredibly rare. Tauros and Kangaskhan have a maximum chance of 4% to show their faces in red and blue, which is up to 10% in yellow. Chansey has the same odds in the Safari Zone, but a chance of 10% in Cerulean Cave, providing an alternative, similar to Cypher and Pinsir also being found in a Game Corner. And that brings me to the winner of these games, another Game Corner legend, Porygon. I've much more often seen people calling Kangaskhan or Tauros some of the hardest Pokemon to get in Kanto, but I am convinced people who call them the hardest are doing so based on FireRed LeafGreen. Because in the original Gen 1 games, getting enough money to buy a Porygon from the Game Corner is an absolute nightmare. Either you play a luck-based game for a ridiculous amount of time, or you're forced to play the Elite Four over and over and over again, assuming you haven't been saving up for Porygon since you first started your journey in Pallet Town. Don't get me wrong, the Safari Zone Pokemon are absolutely no cakewalk either, and it is possible for you to be unable to catch them for a very, very long time, which isn't really possible for Porygon, but on the other hand, Porygon is guaranteed to make you spend a ton of time to get the necessary funds. The Safari Zone Pokemon could potentially be obtained in a few attempts if you're lucky. So for me, Porygon is the winner here. If you disagree though, worry not, the Safari Zone group will have its win later down the line. But for now, we continue in Johto for, well, all Johto-based games, because I think that the hardest Pokemon to obtain is the same for Gold, Silver, Crystal, HeartGold and SoulSilver. And that means that two early candidates didn't end up winning the race, which were Pineco and Heracross. In the original titles, getting these bug types was surprisingly difficult, with a convoluted method behind headbutting trees that depended on your trainer ID number and the route you were on, resulting in a system that's way more confusing than it needed to be. But once you dive into it, it isn't super difficult to get your hands on one of these. That doesn't apply to Raikou and Entei. Roaming Pokemon are notoriously difficult to catch, and in a game without any super rare Pokemon, that is all that's needed to take the title home. These two, and yes, I am excluding Suicune since it isn't a roaming Pokemon in Crystal, and the remakes, will constantly move around the map, forcing you to walk after them, since you flying causes them to move to an adjacent route. Once you have finally found them, you'll need an actual game plan to make sure you can even catch them in battle, which especially at the time had never really been necessary. In HeartGold and SoulSilver, the process is easier than it was before, making it more convenient to track them. But since the headbutt hunt was also made easier, I would still say the two legendary beasts make for the hardest to obtain Pokemon in the most modern rendition of Johto. Next up, Ruby and Sapphire, where we don't have to beat around the bush and discuss a list of options. The answer here is notoriously Milotic. Feebas is the ugly face of Pokemon that are a nightmare to find, only being available on 6 random tiles on Route 119, with you having no way of knowing which tile it is until you try. And be persistent, because Pokemon other than Feebas also appear here. Once you have finally managed to land one, the fun isn't over yet, because while Feebas nowadays evolves using a Prism skill, back in the day you needed to max out its beauty stat. I hope you like that Pokéblock minigame, because you'll be doing it a lot, to finally get your hands on Milotic. All in all, it's a grueling process, and easily the hardest way to obtain a Pokémon, let alone a normal, non-legendary Pokémon, at the time of Gen 3's release. And yet, Milotic isn't the winner for Emerald, despite this method being yet unchanged. Because unlike in Ruby and Sapphire, Milotic, nightmare as it is to obtain, is merely a prerequisite to another trio, the Johto starters. In order to obtain them, you'll need to complete the entire Hoenn-Dex, which obviously includes Milotic, but also 200 others of varying difficulties. Considering the requirement for Cyndaquil, Chikorita and Totodile is literally just Feebas, Milotic and more, I cannot see how any other Pokemon but them can be the winner for Emerald. Simple as that. Next, we return to Kanto for FireRed and LeafGreen, which has a different answer than the original titles all the way back in the 90s had. Because, like I kinda alluded to, Porygon has been made less of a pain to obtain, with the introduction of the Savvy Islands, as in more trainers to give you money, but mostly the Versus Seeker, which allows you to re-battle trainers on routes, meaning it is no longer necessary to repeat the Elite Four until you see Agatha in your sleep. And while that does mean Kangaskhan and Tauros now slide into first place, retaining their spawn chance of red and blue and not the improved one from yellow, there is a new challenger entering the ring. Or rather, two familiar challengers. The legendary beasts return in this game as roaming legendaries, and while chasing them down is not as easy as it would be in HeartGold or SoulSilver, it's also not as difficult as in Gold and Silver. What makes specifically Raikou and Entei more of a problem though is the Roar glitch. If Raikou and Entei use Roar, Suicune doesn't know the move, the game treats it as if they're fainted, meaning they will never reappear. And while that is not too big a problem if you're specifically hunting for them, since I would assume you would always save beforehand, this can be a problem if you stumble upon them by accident. That said, tricky as this makes Entei and Raikou, I still think that Tauros and Kangaskhan are worse, for the simple reason that even if you have a plan, it can take a long while before you finally get them. Raikou and Entei are probably harder when going unprepared, but since this is a post-game thing, I would wager the chances of anyone going at them unprepared is lower than a Safari Zone Mon. Onto Diamond and Pearl and also Platinum, which, similar to Feebas in Gen 3, have one very clear winner, although there is at least some competition this time around. That said, I won't go too deep into the runner-up now, for reasons I'll reveal later, and instead look at the winner only, Munchlax. To quickly sum up, Sinnoh has 21 honey trees, which you can put honey onto to attract the Pokemon. Only 4 of these can contain Munchlax, predetermined at the start of the game based on your trainer ID and a secret ID number, meaning you don't know which one these are. This would already have been difficult as is, but it gets worse. Munchlax only has a 1% chance of appearing on these 4 trees. 1%! And keep in mind, Pokemon only appear on this tree after 6 real-life hours, which you cannot speed up by changing the game's clock. Catching a Munchlax using only a Gen 4 game could take you days, weeks, months even if you're unlucky. This is by far the hardest Pokemon to obtain in Pokemon history, in my opinion. It doesn't get harder than this. If you abide by our rules, that is. Sending in a Snorlax from Gen 3 and then breeding it makes Munchlax suddenly a lot easier to obtain. Since we have already tackled HeartGold and SoulSilver, we continue on to Gen 5, where we once again find the same winner for all games in the region, so both Black and White and their sequels. The Pokemon in question isn't actually a Unova Pokemon though, meaning that in the original 2 games it's a post-game capture, while it isn't in the sequels. Not that that matters for the difficulty though, as Metagross is quite annoying to obtain in both games. Not grueling like Munchlax or even Feebas, but it does factor in something we haven't really brought up much in this video. Catch rate, the formula that decides whether a Pokéball shuts tight or breaks open. It's what makes Caterpie one of the easiest Pokemon to catch, while legendaries are notoriously difficult. And in the same category as say the legendary birds, Lugia and Rayquaza, is the Beldum line. So if you've ever wondered why Beldum somehow seems to take 3 million failed captures before it's finally caught, that's the reason. In Unova, Beldum cannot be found, meaning you'll instead hunt Metang, which only has a 10% chance of appearing in the Giant Chasm, Kyurem's territory. 10% isn't 1% or 4%, obviously, but it's still not a lot, especially for a Pokemon that might take a while to actually be caught in the first place. We move on to the 3DS next, starting with X and Y. These games up the number of available Pokemon massively, and that means hiding them all over the place in random routes with sometimes quite low spawn chances. A big offender of this were horde battles, and that's also where we find our winner. In a fun way to subvert expectations about version exclusives, X and Y changed the spawn chances of Seviper and Zangoose around, but do have both available in the same game. In X, Zangoose has a 35% chance of appearing as a horde battle on Route 8, with one Seviper then appearing in the mix. In Y, this situation is reversed, making this the only way to obtain Seviper in X or Zangoose in Y. So that's a 35% chance of a horde battle, which is already more rare, and then asking you to defeat all Pokemon in the battle before the lone Zangoose or Seviper falls so you can catch it, all while the Zangoose and Seviper all attack each other. It's a tricky situation all around that is hard to really prepare for, since even a trusty false swipe doesn't really work here. It's not Munchlax levels of a nightmare for sure, but this is a hunt with an underrated difficulty. Next up is Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which makes Feebas a lot easier to obtain, now making it a regular encounter on Route 119, meaning it drops down the list and a new winner emerges on top. And that is a Pokemon you might not expect, because it isn't really overly difficult on the surface, but gets significantly worse to actually do. I'm talking about Porygon Z. First things first, you need a Porygon. While not remotely as difficult as Gen 1, Porygon does require a bit of luck, seeing as it is exclusive to a Mirage Island and Mountain that are found by soaring. These locations may or may not show up, requiring a bit of luck to get the whole process started, even if finding Porygon at these two locations is not super tricky. It's evolving it that's the annoying part. As you'll probably know, Porygon requires 2 evolution items to evolve, and while most games make these findable somewhere, RS instead puts them in the Battle Mazon behind BP. Both the upgrade and the dubious disc require 32 BP, which is really not that easily gained. It also doesn't require ridiculous levels of battle prowess, but considering you have to do this twice on top of already having had a bit of luck to find Porygon in the first place, makes it quite a lengthy process all things considered. When we head to Alola for both Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Moon, we tread familiar ground and look at the successor of Horde battles, SOS battles. Several Pokemon are locked behind this mechanic, which can result in quite annoying hunts, constantly having to wait for the source Pokemon to call for help and then making sure you can catch them. Maybe calling these difficult is not the right word, they're not really hard, but they are incredibly tedious and annoying. I would say the worst of these SOS exclusives is Mareanie. They're only summoned by Corsola, which are already not super common to begin with and require you to fish, lengthening the process even further. Once you have finally landed one, the real waiting game begins, which you can speed up with the necessary items of course, but that just brings the general level of difficulty down somewhat. It doesn't make Mareanie drop down the list. SOS battle exclusives are the hardest Pokemon to obtain in Alola, and Mareanie is the hardest of the bunch, that remains, even with items. We move on to the Nintendo Switch next, with Pokemon Let's Go, Pikachu and Eevee, and never before has obtaining the entire Pokédex been this easy. Hell, it's literally the point of the game. Catching is the focus here, not battling. And that also means that even the hardest Pokemon to catch really isn't a nightmare to obtain. It's merely a tad more tricky than your average Rattata or Pidgey. And that Pokemon is Dratini, or rather Dragonite, since evolving it does add a bit more work, similar to Metagross in Gen 5. Dratini can only be found while surfing, or sea skimming, on Route 10 with a 4% chance to spawn. Chance that low would have been a serious annoyance in past games, but with the introduction of overworld Pokemon, it's really not that grueling anymore, it just takes a bit of waiting and surfing around now. So nothing too bad, but still the hardest. Next is Pokemon Sword and Shield, where we find a case similar to X and Y, in the sense that these games have some light version exclusives in the form of the fossils. Getting the fossilized bird and dino is quite easy in Sword, while the fish and drake are common in Shield. But in the opposite game, these fossils are remarkably rare. Trading them is clearly the idea behind this, but since it is possible to obtain all 4 fossils with one cartridge, they do count and are easily the trickiest to obtain in games that make catching every other Pokemon relatively simple. To get the opposite game's fossils, you'll need sheer luck at the digging duo, and with odds around the 1%, chances aren't great. And since Arceus and Dracofish require not just one but both version exclusive fossils to create, they are one step above their fellow fossils and win out as the hardest Pokemon to obtain in Sword and Shield, depending on your version. It's back to remakes next for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which made Munchlax available in the Grand Underground, therefore knocking it down from its elusive first place, even if it is still rare. The new winner is that mysterious runner-up I mentioned earlier that I wouldn't elaborate on, who listens to the name of Spiritomb. While the whole sequence required to get Spiritomb isn't rocket science or really all that luck dependent, it is tedious. First you place the odd keystone on the Hollow Tower. Then you have to talk to 32 named NPCs in the Grand Underground, after which Spiritomb appears at the tower. It's a lengthy process that requires a tad of luck, a lot of button presses and patience in general. And while funnily enough it's actually easier in BDSP than it was in the original games, this time around it finishes on top. And for the next game in line it is definitely a good candidate again. Legends Arceus locks Spiritomb behind completing Request 22, which asks you to collect every single wisp found in Hisui. There is a total of 107 of them, and finding them all is a serious challenge. It's lengthy even if you're just following a guide, let alone if you're doing this without any help. However, as long as this takes and difficult as it is, Spiritomb cannot be the hardest Pokemon to obtain in this game, all thanks to the same principle we saw in Emerald. There, in order to get the Johto starters, you needed Milotic and more. This time around, it's Arceus who's the reward for collecting all Pokemon, meaning Spiritomb and more. Nothing about the process of getting Arceus specifically is harder than getting Spiritomb, but since getting Spiritomb is a part of the requirements for Arceus, it could never be harder to obtain than the Pokemon God. And finally, Scarlet and Violet. This game truly does not have any super difficult Pokemon to obtain. They're all easily available in the overworld, that makes things easy, and while Legends Arceus had that too, Paldea doesn't have any Pokemon locked behind finding all random collectibles or getting the whole dex. Goldengo is the closest probably, but getting enough Gimmighoul coins is significantly easier than finding all wisps. There are a couple of Pokemon that are easy to miss and just not encounter through regular play though, like Barboach, Applin, Slackoff and once again Spiritomb, but once you know where they are, you'll have them in no time. Goodra can also be a bit of an annoying one, since Paldea doesn't have a place where it always rains, so evolving your Sliggoo can take a surprisingly long amount of time, but it's still not the biggest holdup. So yeah, shouldn't you have picked it up by now, the latest Pokemon titles really don't have any Pokemon that are super difficult to obtain, but I would say that if your goal is getting the entire dex, that Ditto and Zorua are probably the hardest to get, simply because they disguise themselves as other Pokemon, which you probably have already caught, therefore not making you likely to engage with them. That makes these two the only Pokemon in Paldea you might have to find yourself actually hunting for, unlike all other Mon that will just spawn right in your face. Obviously, you can also always get them from raids, but that applies to basically every Pokemon, so that doesn't really make them special. That said, it says enough that these two are the winners. Scarlet and Violet really aren't difficult games from the perspective of this video. And that's been my picks. But which Pokemon did you struggle to add to your Pokédex? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Pokemon content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.